She said it had to end tonight, but I looked into her eyes and promised to make tonight endless. I hadn't planned on seeing her that night. My steps had carried me to my friend's house almost out of habit, expecting the familiar laugh of someone my own age opening the door. But instead, when the door swung inward, it was her standing there, his mother. She was 42, a woman whose presence carried both quiet strength and a weight I could never fully put into words. The pale porch light cast a golden halo across her dark hair, and for a brief second, I forgot to speak. She didn't greet me with the usual warmth I'd grown used to over the years. Instead, her eyes narrowed ever so slightly, as though she'd been waiting, not for me, but for the moment itself. In her arms, she held a folded sweater, clutched tight against her chest like a shield. "He's not home," she said softly, but the way her voice trembled hinted that my arrival wasn't entirely unwelcome. "But you can come in." I hesitated at the threshold, sensing an invisible line drawn between us. The house was quiet, too quiet, as though the walls themselves were listening. I stepped inside anyway, pulled forward by something I didn't dare name. The air was faintly scented with lavender, the kind of fragrance that lingers not from perfume but from habit, like freshly washed sheets or a candle long since blown out. We moved into the living room, and she set the sweater on the back of the sofa, her fingers lingering on the fabric longer than necessary. Her movements were careful, deliberate, as though she was buying herself time before saying what she had already decided to tell me. I sat down slowly, my palms pressed together, watching her from the edge of the sofa like a guest who wasn't sure he should stay. Finally, she turned, arms folded across her chest, and sighed. "We can't keep ignoring this," she murmured. Her eyes flicked to mine, and in that moment I felt both exposed and invited, like she was daring me to speak. But my throat caught, the words trapped somewhere between fear and longing. I noticed how tightly she held her arms against herself, how her shoulders rose and fell in a rhythm too fast to be calm. She was strong, no doubt, but beneath that strength was a vulnerability she could no longer hide. And for the first time, I understood that this wasn't just a conversation. It was the opening of a door neither of us could close again. The living room felt unfamiliar, even though I had been there countless times before. That night, the silence pressed differently against the walls. The only source of light came from a tall standing lamp in the corner, its soft amber glow spilling across the beige carpet and the edges of the sofa. Shadows stretched long, giving the room a hushed, almost sacred feeling. She motioned for me to sit, and I lowered myself into the corner of the sofa while she remained standing for a moment, as if weighing whether to join me. When she finally sat across from me, I could see the hesitation in her posture. Her back was straight, almost rigid, and her arms folded tightly across her chest, a protective barrier. Her eyes avoided mine, darting instead to the bookshelf, the framed photographs on the wall, the small details of the room she knew by heart. It was as though looking directly at me might undo whatever fragile control she had built around herself. "You know this isn't right," she began, her voice steady but carrying an edge of weariness. "I shouldn't even be talking to you like this. It's not fair, to you, to him, to me." She shook her head and let out a breath that sounded heavier than it should have been. Her fingers tightened against her arms, and for the first time I noticed her wedding ring missing, a small but telling absence. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees, my hands clasped together. I didn't interrupt. I knew she wasn't looking for answers, not yet. She needed to let the words escape first. My eyes stayed on her, trying to read the spaces between what she said and what she meant. Her voice softened as she continued. "People would never understand. They'd call it wrong, reckless, selfish." Her throat caught, and for the briefest second, she looked at me. The glance was quick, but it was enough. The truth was written in her eyes, not anger, not rejection, but fear of how much she already cared. The silence after her confession stretched long, but not empty. I shifted slightly, letting my hand rest against the cushion between us, just close enough that if she wanted to, she could bridge the gap. She noticed. I saw the way her breath hitched, her chest rising with sharp restraint. She didn't move her hand to meet mine, but she also didn't pull away. That tiny space between us felt like the most fragile border in the world, and both of us were standing right at its edge. Her words fell into the quiet like a stone dropped into still water. "This ends tonight." The finality in her tone struck me harder than I expected. For a moment, all I could do was sit there, watching the way her jaw tightened, how her eyes darted toward the window as if she couldn't bear to see my reaction. Then, almost abruptly, she stood. Her arms folded across her chest again, this time tighter, as though she was holding herself together before she shattered. She walked to the curtains, the hem of her soft cardigan brushing against her hips with each step. She stopped there, her fingers gripping the fabric of the curtain as though she needed something solid to anchor her. Moonlight spilled through the glass, outlining her frame in a pale glow. The silver light softened her strength, making her look at once untouchable and heartbreakingly fragile. I rose slowly, my pulse quickening in my chest. She didn't turn, but I could sense the way her shoulders stiffened as I moved closer, as though she could feel my presence before I even crossed the room. The space between us shrank, and with it, the safety she had built around her words seemed to crumble. "Why are you doing this to yourself?" I asked gently, my voice low, steady. "Why fight something you already feel?" Her head dipped, her dark hair falling slightly forward, hiding part of her face. I caught the glint of unshed tears along her lashes when she finally turned her head halfway toward me. "Because it's wrong," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Because you're too young, because I'm supposed to be stronger than this. Because people will never forgive me if they knew." I closed the last of the distance, not touching her yet, but near enough that my shadow merged with hers against the curtain. My hand hovered inches from hers, trembling with the weight of everything I wanted to say, everything I wanted to feel. "You don't have to be stronger tonight," I whispered back. For the first time, she didn't retreat. She stood still, her breathing unsteady, her body caught between resisting and surrendering. The room felt charged, every second stretching longer than it should. I saw the battle in her eyes, the urge to push me away warring with the longing to let me in. And though her lips repeated, "This ends tonight," her body betrayed her. She hadn't stepped back. She hadn't broken the fragile space that bound us together. The space between us held its own gravity, pulling me closer even as her words still clung to the air. Her shoulders rose and fell with each uneven breath, her eyes searching mine for something she couldn't admit aloud. And then, almost unconsciously, her hand slipped away from the curtain, fingers curling slightly as though her body had betrayed the resolve in her mind. I didn't reach for her right away. I stood there, my hand suspended by my side, fighting my own hesitation. But when the silence grew too heavy, I let my fingers graze against hers, the lightest contact, barely more than a brush of skin. The touch was so fleeting it could have been dismissed as accidental, yet it carried the weight of every unspoken word we hadn't dared to voice. She inhaled sharply, the sound trembling in her throat. For a moment, I thought she would recoil. But instead, she let her hand rest in mine, tentative and trembling. Her skin was warm, almost fevered, and I could feel the pulse in her wrist racing beneath my fingertips. It wasn't a grip, not yet, just her hand resting against my palm like something fragile, like a secret too delicate to be spoken aloud. Her lips parted, a whisper escaping that wasn't a word but more of a release, the sound of someone giving in to what they had fought against for too long. I closed my hand gently around hers, not to claim, not to trap, but to steady. The tremor in her fingers softened beneath my hold, and she exhaled slowly, her breath warm in the stillness of the room. "I shouldn't," she murmured, her voice so faint it nearly disappeared. But her hand didn't move. If anything, she leaned ever so slightly closer, her shoulder brushing against my arm as though drawn to the steadiness of my presence. The lamp behind us cast a warm glow across her face, illuminating the faint lines of worry that softened when her eyes met mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The world outside the window was hushed, the moon watching quietly, the night holding its breath along with us. I felt her heartbeat through that single point of contact, fast but steadying against mine. And in that touch, in the fragile warmth of her palm resting inside mine, I realized that sometimes the simplest gestures carry the deepest confessions. We weren't just holding hands. We were holding everything we weren't supposed to say. We stood there, hands joined in a silence that seemed to hum with its own electricity. The lamp's amber glow wrapped us in a cocoon of warmth, softening the edges of the room until it felt like nothing else existed outside that small circle of light. She hadn't pulled away, though I could feel the slight tremor in her hand. It wasn't weakness, it was restraint, the kind born of knowing exactly what she wanted but fearing the weight of it. Her eyes finally lifted to mine, and in them I saw the storm she had been trying so desperately to contain. Doubt, longing, fear, all of it tangled together. "We can't do this," she whispered, her voice fraying at the edges. Yet her hand tightened almost imperceptibly in mine, betraying the truth her words tried to deny. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let my thumb brush slowly across the back of her hand, tracing the delicate lines of her skin. The simple movement drew a shiver from her, and her shoulders softened, as though the tension she carried had finally found a release. I stepped just a little closer, close enough that I could see the fine strands of hair falling across her cheek. With my free hand, I reached up carefully, brushing the strand back and tucking it gently behind her ear. My fingers lingered for a heartbeat against her temple, not bold, not rushed, just steady, an invitation without demand. She closed her eyes at the touch, her lips parting slightly as if she had forgotten to breathe. When she exhaled, it was soft, trembling, a sound caught between surrender and protest. And then she leaned, just enough that her cheek hovered near my shoulder, as though gravity itself had betrayed her resolve. The moment stretched endlessly. Neither of us spoke, neither of us moved to break it. Time seemed suspended, the tick of the clock on the wall fading into the background. Every small detail became heightened, the rhythm of her breath, the warmth of her skin, the way her hand fit so naturally in mine despite everything that should have kept us apart. She finally whispered again, but softer this time, almost pleading with herself rather than me, "This isn't right." I didn't argue. I didn't try to convince her. I only held her hand a little more firmly, letting the silence speak for me. Because in that pause, in that endless, fragile pause, we both already knew the truth neither of us could say aloud. Her eyes opened slowly, meeting mine in the dim light, and I could see the war raging inside her. Every part of her face carried contradiction, the tightened jaw of restraint, the trembling lips of surrender, the glisten in her gaze that betrayed how long she'd been holding this conflict inside. She drew in a deep breath, as if bracing herself against her own weakness, and repeated the words like a verdict, "This ends tonight." But the words sounded hollow now, almost like she was trying to convince herself rather than me. She released my hand halfway, but her fingers still lingered against my palm, unable to let go completely. I studied her quietly, the rise and fall of her chest, the way her shoulders pulled back as though she wanted to project strength. And then, before she could retreat further, I spoke. My voice was steady, softer than a whisper yet firm enough to slice through the tension hanging between us. "Then let's make tonight endless." The effect was immediate. Her lips parted, and for the first time that evening, she let out a laugh, but not one of mockery or disbelief. It was fragile, breathless, a sound caught somewhere between relief and fear. A laugh that said she had been waiting for someone to say those words out loud, even if she never dared to admit it. She shook her head lightly, her hair brushing against her cheeks. "You don't know what you're saying," she murmured, but the way her hand lifted betrayed her again. She reached up, fingers trembling as they brushed along my cheek, trailing slowly down the line of my jaw. Her touch was hesitant, almost reverent, as though she was memorizing the shape of me while she still could. The warmth of her fingertips sent a rush through me, steady and undeniable. I closed my eyes for just a second, letting myself lean into her touch without pulling it closer, without asking for more. When I opened them again, her expression had softened. The sharpness of her resistance had dulled, leaving only the quiet vulnerability of someone who no longer had the strength to keep pretending. "You're too young," she whispered again, but her voice lacked conviction now. The words were little more than an echo of the excuses she'd built for herself. Her thumb brushed across my cheekbone, lingering there as though she needed to hold on to something solid in the storm she was caught inside. In that moment, nothing outside the room mattered, not the weight of judgment, not the fear of consequence. Only her trembling hand against my face, and the defiance in my promise that tonight wouldn't end. The storm between us had finally softened into something quieter, something almost fragile. Her hand still rested against my cheek, her thumb barely moving, as if she were afraid the moment would shatter if she let it go. I covered her hand gently with mine, steadying it there, giving her the reassurance she couldn't bring herself to ask for. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Words felt too small for what lingered in the air. She drew in a shaky breath and let her hand fall, but before the distance between us could return, I caught her fingers and guided us both back toward the sofa. We sat side by side, close enough that our shoulders touched, the contact natural and unforced. The silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like rest, like we had finally stopped fighting against something that had been pulling at us for too long. Her head lowered slowly until it found its place against my shoulder. The weight of it was delicate, yet grounding, as though she was testing the safety of leaning on me, and when I didn't move away, she let herself relax into it fully. I felt the warmth of her cheek through the fabric of my shirt, the gentle brush of her hair against my jaw whenever she shifted. My arm slipped almost instinctively around her, a simple gesture, but one that spoke of protection rather than possession. "I don't know what this makes us," she whispered, her voice muffled against me. "It makes us honest," I replied softly. She didn't answer, but I felt her body ease against mine, her breathing evening out as though the words were enough for now. The world outside carried on, cars passing in the distance, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, but inside that room, time felt stretched. It wasn't endless, not really, but it was long enough to feel like the night belonged only to us. Her hand found mine again, resting between us on the cushion, her fingers weaving loosely through mine. It wasn't a desperate grip, just the quiet comfort of contact. And as I sat there with her leaning into me, I realized that endings aren't always sharp or sudden. Sometimes, they're gentle. Sometimes, they look more like beginnings. When I finally spoke again, it was in the rhythm of a thought I wanted her to carry with her long after the night was over: we don't have to know what tomorrow is. Tonight is enough. And for once, she didn't argue.